So good morning, welcome everyone. We're really pleased that you're here to join us for this webinar, Tackling the Health Crisis Together. This is the first event in Future of London's programme, Healthy Neighbourhoods Working Together. The programme aims to find effective solutions to the collaboration challenges between the health and built environment sectors. And the programme is possible thanks to our wonderful sponsors, Montagu Evans, Mount Anvil and Pollard Thomas Edwards Architects. I'll tell you a bit more about the programme in a moment, but before I do, I just want to do a bit of housekeeping. So you may have noticed we're recording the session. It will be available on our YouTube channel not long afterwards and up on our website as well. We really want to make the session as interactive as possible. So if you haven't already, please change your screen name so that we can see who you all are and where you work. And also please get involved with the chat. Be great if you can just use the chat to say hello to people, tell us who you are, what you're working on. You can use it to share any resources that you think the rest of the audience might be interested in. And it will also, we've also got the Q&A function where you can enter your questions at any time for our wonderful panel today. In the chat, you can also private message anyone if there's someone you want to kind of get in contact with directly. And you can also follow live tweets on this and any of our events in the programme using our hashtag Healthy Places. So just the agenda today, the format will be a quick outline from me, then an introductory presentation to set the scene from Michael Parsons at Impact on Urban Health, and he's going to really kind of set the context for today. And then we have a set of 3 speakers after that who will reflect from their own work on the barriers that we've identified and how these can be overcome to deliver projects that successfully respond to health issues as well as to other urban challenges. And there will be time for your questions and some further discussion at the end. So a bit of background on the Healthy Neighbourhoods Working Together project. We're focusing on this theme this year because we know that our network of built environment professionals recognises that we all have a role to play in responding to the health crisis. London has the biggest health inequalities in England, and the pandemic has only served to highlight and exacerbate this. It's predicted that there's going to be a 33% increase in demand for mental health services over the next 3 years. Now, we know that cities have huge potential to contribute to health and that the built environment influences our levels of activity, travel patterns, our socialising, social connections. Programmes like Healthy Streets, One Public Estate and the Healthy New Towns have really helped to encourage collaboration between sectors and to shape our programme. And there's also been lots of brilliant work on what makes a healthy place or what makes a healthy neighbourhood. So the principles are there, but we don't always know the best way to work with health colleagues. There's a sense that perhaps we don't understand each other's ways of working, or we just don't know who is the best person to contact for any given project at the right time. So what this programme seeks to do is highlight the barriers to effective collaboration with the health sector and provide practical and inspirational ways to overcome these. So today is about launching the programme, putting the scale of the health challenge in context for our sector, and through some real life examples, providing some really practical ways of navigating projects to overcome these barriers. Now, we've identified a few barriers affecting our sector's ability to collaborate with health, and you're going to see these up on screen in the form of a poll really shortly. We would like to get your thoughts just to kind of get started on what you feel is the biggest barrier that we need to overcome to effective collaboration. So you should see these up on your screen now. Please just let us know which you think is the biggest stumbling block from your work. Don't kind of think too much about it, just go with your gut. And a bit later on in the Q&A, we'll reflect a little bit on this. So just give you a minute to pop your responses in. And while you're having to think about that, I'm going to introduce our first speaker. So I'm introducing Michael Parsons, who is at Impact on Urban Health. Michael is part of a team that's been working on a piece of work called Easing Pressures. Now, this seeks to demonstrate the link between work, money, homes and health, and making recommendations to address these and reduce inequalities in some of the most deprived parts of London. Michael's going to give the key findings for his work to demonstrate the scale, but also give us a bit of an idea of how this relates to the rest of London. I should say before he starts, his slides are really data heavy and there's a lot to take in, and he's told us he's more than happy to share the slides afterwards. So don't feel you need to kind of absorb it all on the first round. He's happy for you to be able to take another look at those later. So over to Michael.
Thanks for that, Hannah. Hi, everyone. I trust you're all well out there, and I'm not just howling into an abyss. Thanks to Future of London for inviting us to come to be part of this event in the series. It's close to our heart, and it looks like it'd be a really great series. So as Hannah said, I'm Michael, and I'm from Impact on Urban Health. For those of you who don't know us, Impact on Urban Health is a very new name for a very old creature. The foundation of which we're a part, Guy's and St Thomas's Foundation, has about 500 years of history, but we launched the Impact on Urban Health brand this year, or at the end of last, to more clearly reflect our mission. Could I get the next slide, please? I think it works. But we're a place-based foundation. We're the largest in the UK. We focus on the people in our home of the boroughs of Lambeth and Southwark and South London. We look for approaches that will improve their health, reduce health inequality, and by doing so, find ways to improve urban health more generally, both through the UK and abroad. So we're deeply tied to place with that long history and a real desire to work with the people and communities in that place. And we're also committed to bringing data, research, and the best contemporary evidence to bear to help us improve health. So when we consider that evidence and the role that we as an organization are best placed to play, and similarities in urban health throughout the world, we find that when we do work on reducing these health inequalities, we don't normally do so with healthcare directly or healthcare only. We see our role as convening a wide range of organizations around the idea of improving health and finding evidence-led ways for those coalitions to act on health inequalities. So this means, for example, supporting shareholder pressure groups to encourage supermarkets to sell healthier foods, working with lettings agents to improve the experience of the private rented sector, or backing approaches to replace delivery vans with delivery cargo bikes to improve the state of the air we breathe. Ultimately, yes, we hold that our environments, be they social, physical, or commercial, are the biggest influence over our health, and that working collaboratively with those who control or influence those environments has a large and replicable effect. So we think that these approaches are relevant to urban health everywhere. Next slide, please. So the program I work on looks at those environments for adults who are most at risk of developing long-term health conditions. Those conditions have a disproportionate effect on people's quality of life, on the health system, and on the economy. And we try to find ways to change those systems that feed health inequalities. As Hannah said earlier, we've recently launched a report, Easing Pressures, which covers some of our work in this space. And in that report, we've combined data, expert evidence, and lived experience to look at some of those social factors. And again, we're particularly considering financial health, secure homes, good work, and our neighbourhood environments. So today I'll talk a little bit about some of that work, about the link between those environments and health as we see it, and particularly focusing on neighbourhoods. But before I do that, I'm going to completely spoil my own ending and mention three things I'm going to return to that we think are crucial for building a systems approach that improves rather than damages people's health, and that we think are relevant to many in this virtual room. So those are, next slide, please. So that the coalition for improving health should be broad, that equity comes from design, not just access, and that we should be building trust and sharing power. Right, okay, so first thinking about neighbourhoods, and next slide, please. Here's where we get to the data heavy slides Hannah warned you about. So it's not surprising to say that deprivation is strongly correlated with health outcomes. And across the board, we see this over and over. Heat maps of poverty are also heat maps of poor health. And this slide shows that healthy life years expected tracks neighbourhood deprivation. Next slide, please. And in another way, we can see that neighbourhood deprivation and those long-term health conditions that I mentioned earlier are really closely correlated in our boroughs anyway in South London. So great. Looking at that, you could say we should all be focused on raising income and reducing income inequality. And obviously there's a ton of evidence that that works on a macro level. But wish as we might, it's very hard to create higher incomes, certainly from our position and from most other positions. But at a micro level, the picture throws up some details we can act on and some partnerships we can form. So next slide, please. So one of the things we've done, the detail here doesn't matter, is to create an index comparing the 68 neighbourhoods within our boroughs across a range of mostly non-health indicators, from speed of broadband, connections to rates of crime. And normally the deprivation in one area matches deprivation in another. But when you stack those neighbourhoods up, not everything does match that trend. So can I get the next slide, please? So here you can see there are two neighbourhoods we've highlighted. You may not be able to see, which have very similar income levels, looking along the x-axis, but very different health outcomes. Here, the colour of the circle. So next slide, please. And when we plot those on a graph, we can see that there are completely different ends of the health spectrum, which is not necessarily what you'd expect. So that's worth looking into for us. What does the data tell us is different? So when you pull out the different parts of that index to look at where there are differences, this really stands out. Next slide, please. Okay, you can see those neighbourhoods. You may not be able to see, you might just have to trust me. Those neighbourhoods have very, very different levels of an indicator of community needs. That's a complex indicator, but includes things like social connectedness, access to transport and training, and cultural and civic participation. Those are the sorts of things we'd think of as an engaged community in a healthy neighbourhood. So from the data, that might be where you choose to act to improve health. But the point here is those sorts of things can't be improved just by looking at a GP surgery, or just through the job centre, or through any one organisation making a decision. It involves a broad set of factors, from housing associations to planners to community and grassroots groups to SHIP. So when I say that the coalition for improving health should be broad, I don't mean that organisations should repurpose themselves around health, but that organisations could be better at recognising that they do have a role to play in health, and that when you're thinking about health, you have to have a big tent. Health is enabled at a neighbourhood level, and engaged neighbourhoods are healthy neighbourhoods. So at Impact on Urban Health, we support social infrastructure in particular neighbourhoods, which doesn't necessarily look like a health thing, but amongst its many other benefits, it definitely is. Right, so of course, the most important feature of neighbourhoods for most people is that that's where people make their homes. So in our work, we look at some of the data correlates for health and home. Starting with mental health, we can see, in the next slide, please. Right, so that there's a pretty strong correlation between areas that have the highest burden of mental ill health and that are both expensive and overcrowded. And of course, those two go together. And we also know that those suffering the worst health inequalities are those who are experiencing rough sleeping. We know that homelessness isn't just a cause of ill health, it's frequently caused by ill health, amongst many other factors. And people experiencing homelessness more generally, those in temporary accommodation, tend to experience dramatic health impacts, particularly depression, where about half of all adults in temporary accommodation have symptoms of depression, much higher than the background rate. And in fact, next slide, please. So nearly half of all private renters experience anxiety as a result of their home, and loss of a private sector tenancy is a major driver of homelessness. So by following that chain of mixed evidence, we can see that acting in this sort of space, improving the stability of people's rental situations, has a strong protective effect on people's health. So the private rented sector, particularly the bottom third, can be pretty bad for people's health, but it's also a system which is being designed, even if it doesn't always appear it. It's a system crossing borders involving tenants, landlords, councils, developers, governments, and more. And it could be redesigned with health and health equity in mind. We're working with social lettings agencies to try and change people's experience of the PRS. And there are lots of other ways that people can improve rental stability. I'm sure there'll be some in the room familiar with interventions here. Right, so the last example I wanted to talk about to help set the scene is a little bit messier. So again, by looking at the data, the next slide, please. Right, we can see that health outcomes differ very widely by ethnicity. Again, and regrettably, this is no longer a surprise. And to be clear, I should be very clear, this isn't explained by genetics or any such thing. These are the results of social factors that add up to a systemic racism. Next slide, please. Looking at what that means in our place, we can see that there's a lot of diversity between neighbourhoods as well as within them. And this sort of pattern is repeated in a lot of urban areas, and that health outcomes vary in a predictable way as a result. We know that minoritized ethnic communities have lower average income, for example, which is a problem in and of itself, but it doesn't explain it all. One of the things we've done is supported community researchers, which are trained people who speak to members of their local communities, for example, on housing estates, as equals in semi-structured interviews to get at some of the issues behind the numbers. And when we do that, we hear things like this. Next slide, please. I'll just leave that there for a second. I wouldn't do it justice if I read it out. But it's about trust more generally amongst some minoritized ethnic communities. And it's important to remember that this sort of thing is raised when we're asking about health-related issues. And we hear similar things a lot, that mistrust of one part of the system leads to mistrust more generally. And look, he's got a point. If your experience is that you aren't listened to and you aren't treated well in general, and you don't make decisions that affect your life, of course, that tracks to other relationships. In our place at the moment, there's a particular salience to this. We know that Lambeth has very low levels of vaccine trust, for example. Sorry, I've raised the C issue. Really pronounced amongst care workers. And that's a public health emergency, in large part created by things that have at face value nothing to do with public health. They're to do with equity. So power, and the way that power is used to create or remove trust, is something that most of us on this call anyway, have in some way over some environment. And this is part of why we think it's important to share power and build trust. And there are benefits for everyone. For us, we measure that health benefit. For others, there will be different outcomes, but trust has a huge role to play in all of it. And most importantly, it improves people's lives. I should mention as well that I've highlighted ethnicity in this case because it is a really major factor, and because Lambeth and Southwark are particularly diverse, so it comes up a lot in our work. But this will be replicated in any case where there's a low power, low trust community, which is common across urban environments globally. Next slide, please. So there we go, there's that ending I spoiled, finishing where I started. There are many ways to make neighbourhoods healthier and to respond to crises in health. But we think that these are three really important factors from diving into the data and speaking to people. And these factors give many of us an opportunity to act. Next slide, please. Right, great. So I hope that helps set the scene as we see it as an organization. I haven't necessarily covered much in the way of responses to what I've highlighted, but I can go into some of those in the discussion and answer any questions. And now I'll give you back to Hannah.
Thanks, Michael. And yeah, not your role to give the answers, you're setting the scene, and that's brilliant. And I really like the kind of focus on community and neighbourhoods, health being enabled at a neighbourhood level, which I'm sure lots of our audience will relate to. Just to say, continue to add your questions to the Q&A. If later you are brave enough to come on camera to ask your question to the panel, you can raise your digital hand and we can enable you to speak, to put your camera on. And we'd really love it if people are willing to do that, because it just makes it all feel a bit more familiar. So please just, raise your digital hand if you'd like us to come to you in the Q&A later on. Now on to Bhavini Shah from Montagu Evans. Bav's role sees her working closely with NHS bodies and advising them on estates issues. So she's going to offer us some insight on how these barriers play out in real life. Thanks, Bav.
Hi there, thanks Hannah. So good morning everyone, and thank you to Future of London for inviting me to speak to you all today. As Hannah said, my name's Bhavini or Bhav Shah. I'm an associate in the development team at Montagu Evans, and as Hannah said, my work centres around advising predominantly NHS trusts on the acquisition of land to deliver modern healthcare facilities, and then on the flip side, the disposal of land surplus to requirements, with land receipts inevitably being reinvested back into the NHS. And it's for this reason what I'll talk to you about today predominantly has a property focus within an NHS perspective. And I firstly wanted to touch on the easing pressures research conducted by Impact on Urban Health, and having listened to Michael and completed some reading prior to today, the key points that jumped out at me were kind of the importance of civic infrastructure, involving the community, which you could see was a theme throughout his presentation, and meeting local needs. And for my NHS clients, this is the objective. It's about meeting local needs now and in the future. And in addition to that, it's addressing health inequalities, reducing the burden on NHS beds, and most importantly, promoting physical and mental well-being. COVID's brought the need for high quality space and place to the forefront, and it's never been more important for both physical and mental health to deliver quality places. Next slide, please. So today I'll cover these three areas. So firstly, my view of where I see existing barriers preventing collaboration, and that's based mostly on my own experience. And whilst I will be identifying the barriers, I'll try where possible to identify potential solutions or draw on examples where barriers are beginning to be overcome and then how. I'll then go through some examples to demonstrate where the public sector has successfully collaborated. And then lastly, I'll take you through an approach to hopefully encourage collaboration and that first conversation amongst public sector partners. Next slide, please. So firstly, the barriers. In my opinion, I'd say the overarching barrier is structural. So it's about the way in which different parts of the public sector operates and how that differs across the different parts of the public sector. And that can be in terms of the timescales, competing financial pressures, and sometimes it's just hard to organise, to understand an organisational structure, which often can make engagement quite difficult. So starting with timescales, the different entities, as I say, often work to different timescales. And for me, a clear example of this is how, which is a barrier to collaboration, is when, say, for example, on the one hand, you have an NHS trust locally that's developing its clinical and estate strategy at one point in time for a specific period, and it's usually a relatively short to medium term period. And on the other hand, you could compare that to, say, a local authority developing its local plan at another point in time for a different period, circa 15 years, though I appreciate this is often kept under review and it's evolving, but it's often for a longer period. And from that, you can clearly see how a local NHS trust and a local authority are unlikely to cross paths at the most opportune time for both parties. And I'd say that one way in which I can see this partly being overcome is through the anticipated role of integrated care systems, or ICSs as they're commonly known. And some of you may have heard about that, or may even sit on an ICS in London. Just a bit of background about that then. So there's 42 ICSs across England, and there's 5 that cover the London area. And the aim of an ICS is to bring together providers and commissioners of NHS services across a specific geographical area. And that's alongside local authorities and other local partners, so that they can collectively plan health and care services that meet the needs of the population. So ICSs should really be the way forward, with local authorities and the NHS collaborating, and hopefully that would be regularly enough to encourage change and collaboration. Moving on to financial pressures. A good example, I was thinking about this yesterday, and I say a good example of what we're working on at the moment. So we're advising an NHS client on the disposal of a site to a local authority, and this is outside of London, it's in Norfolk. But it's something we see again and again. So the site forms part of a wider parcel of land, majority owned by the council, with other owners including the NHS, fire and ambulance services. And these public sector partners collaborated previously to deliver a hub which consolidated most of these services into a hub and modern hub in another location. So what was left was to negotiate and agree what would happen with the existing site. And with the council being the majority landowner and the local planning authority, it inevitably made sense for them to lead on this. And the council rightly has plans to deliver housing for local people, but where the deal almost became unstuck was when the council's aspirations to deliver a high quality scheme with high environmental credentials meant the scheme was delivering negative land value, and that was shared across the partners, and inevitably we're representing our NHS client. But you will be pleased to hear that through negotiation and discussion, And I think most importantly, the understanding of each other's objectives, particularly related to the need to achieve best value for the public purse. The deal's now going ahead with a land receipt for our client. And it's often these competing financial pressures that understandably make or break a deal. And here the solution to the barrier was communication. There's financial pressures, but it was talking the issue through and understanding each party's side. I'd also add that engaging earlier on, maybe to understand the funding opportunities available, and perhaps discussing the exit strategy earlier on for the existing site could have potentially assisted in negotiations further down the line too. So lastly is organisational structure. Again, another example which I relayed on a kind of panellist call that we had previously with Future of London was linked to a Section 106 agreement I read a year or so ago whilst advising another NHS client. So my client had sold quite a large plot of land, surplus plot of land, to a national house builder. And because of the scale of the residential scheme to be delivered, there was a requirement through the planning process for the developer to reserve a small plot to deliver a health centre to meet local needs. And within that Section 106 agreement, the developer was required to contact, quote unquote, the NHS in order to transfer that plot of land. So it wasn't the local trust that had been referenced or the local clinical commissioning group. It was simply the NHS. But understandably, how the NHS is organised is unknown to many. There's NHS in England and Improvement, there's the Department of Health, clinical commissioning groups, NHS property services, NHS trusts, and the list goes on and on. So for most, the most consistent point of NHS contact is usually your GP or a dentist. So understandably, there's some work to be done to demystify the NHS and its structure and how to break this down as a barrier. And again, I think the ICS have a role to play here in addressing this barrier. However, the evolution of the ICS and embedding of ICSs in some places will take time. Some are more forward-thinking and more embedded than others. And I would hope that opportunities aren't lost in the meantime. And hopefully my later slide should hopefully get a conversation started whilst this embedding takes place. Next slide, please. And I wanted to talk you through some examples of successful public sector collaboration. An example of a scheme that Montagu has had early involvement in is one that I expect many will be aware of purely because of the scale at Northwick Park. And as you may know, it brings together Brent Council, London North West University Healthcare NHS Trust, the University of Westminster and Housing Association Network Homes. The scheme benefits from one public estate funding, as well as Homes England infrastructure funding to deliver this 1,600 home scheme, which will see commercial, education and public realm spaces also delivered. And you might know that Brent Council unanimously approved the scheme at committee earlier on in March this year. But not all collaborations have to be at this scale, and I anticipate there's great examples of collaboration on varying scales across London, which I hope the audience will highlight. I'd be keen to learn more. But what I'll do now is I'll touch on some projects outside of London that I'm aware of over the next few slides. Next slide, please. So this is a typical example of what we advise a number of our NHS clients on, health hubs. And this is the bringing together or consolidation of services into modern and often flexible buildings. So this example in Wolverhampton saw the collaboration of a number of local NHS trusts alongside the City Council. The project took advantage of central funding, the Better Care Fund funding from NHS England and Improvement to deliver the scheme. And as a result of the delivery of the new hub, 60 health and social care professionals were able to sit together and build in a building and deliver joined up care. And I understand that staff working at the hub reported that there had been significant improvements in coordination and efficiencies as a result of co-locating. So a really positive experience, and you can see that was delivered in 2018, and we've seen a number of other hubs delivered across the country since then as well. Next slide, please. So Life Rooms is a project by Merseycare NHS Foundation Trust, and as the name suggests, Mersey, they're in the Northwest, and that was delivered with the support of other local NHS trusts and the City Council again. So Life Rooms offers a free NHS service to the community, offering opportunities in volunteering, employment, learning, vocational training and pathways advice. And this links to much of what the Ease and Pressures research by Impact on Urban Health spoke about in terms of the importance of quality housing and secure work and their impact on health outcomes. And Merseycare, it's important to note, is one of the largest mental health trusts in England. So whilst a lot of the services they're providing are acute or health related, they see the impact of these more social services to the local population. And again, it's important to note that these life room services are in areas of significant health inequalities too. There's a total of 5 locations, and 4 of them are up on the screen there. Next slide, please. So the next example takes us to the County of Kent and the 1U operation, and I think this is one for Stephen Boxall, who submitted a question earlier about Kent. So the first 1U shop opened up in the Park Mall in Ashford in 2017, I think, and there's now a multitude of 1U shops across the county, and so that's a proven model for the county. Just diving into the first 1U shop, which was the real success story, just to give you a flavour of how the collaboration took place. So Kent County Council funded the 1U service, Ashford Borough Council funded and provided the unit within the shopping mall, and then Kent Community Health financed the refurbishment of the shop and operates the service. So a real collaboration, a meeting of minds, both on a kind of financial and operational on a financial and operational basis. The 1U service offers information, advice and lifestyle services through clinics and drop-in services, with services focusing on helping people to get moving, drink less, eat more healthily, quit smoking, to simply improve health, physical and mental well-being. And they also support local businesses by helping them to implement changes to support their staff as well, which is equally important. Next slide, please. So for my last slide, I wanted to talk about having that first conversation and what that could involve, as well as setting out some of the potential steps ahead to help in building the case for collaboration. So the first step is to understand end users and their needs, so understand the local population, what's needed now and in the future, and appreciating that there's not one size that fits all, and that meeting local need now and in the future, as I say, is key. Next, which is really important, is to map community and healthcare assets, and that's just to simply understand where the opportunities and synergies are between public sector partners. And a key area to avoid simply doubling up work, because the resource is quite tight, is to look to do this through the ICS, because that's where hopefully the right party should be at the table. Next is to adopt a systems thinking approach, and by this it's more about mapping the skills and knowledge of the key stakeholders that are around that table, and it's also important to involve the community here, because they're kind of on the ground, have detailed knowledge of the local area, and are equally important as part of the equation. Next, when it comes to it, is to define the business case, the kind of 5-case model, Green Book case, and that's inevitably specific to each project. And lastly, it's to create empowerment and work in partnerships. And I think the main point I wanted to draw on here is kind of linking back to my Norfolk example, where I mentioned that funding was quite an important part to have had account of maybe earlier on. And there's a real plethora of funding opportunities available out there, inevitably because of COVID, some of the kind of hurdles and opportunities are kind of changing, but as we've already mentioned, One Public Estate, the Towns Fund, Levelling Up Fund, even planning contributions, Section 106 financial contributions and SIL, and what could be invested through there into new facilities. And on the NHS side, the Health Infrastructure Plan, if some of you may have heard of that, the focus at the moment is delivering 40 acute hospitals, but central government's aware that the focus needs to evolve and change, and hopefully there's a view to focus on mental health. Funding for more community services. And then lastly, as mentioned in the Wolverhampton Hub example, the Better Care Fund, that's funding delivered NHS centrally. Next slide, please. So that concludes my presentation. I hope you found that helpful, and I look forward to more of a conversation later on. Thank you.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks, Bav, and thanks for highlighting, I think, some really kind of relevant stuff at the moment, stuff about the new role of the integrated care systems, but also that Kent example, using an empty retail unit, which I think, has got huge potential given the situation we're in at the moment. Right, next to Patrick from Pollard Thomas Edwards Architects. Patrick's got vast experience across housing and regeneration, also a focus on housing for the third age. He's going to offer a design perspective and draw on 2 case studies that illustrate a sort of place-based approach to health, and a few more hub examples, as Bav just started to introduce to us. So go Go ahead, Patrick.
Thank you, Hannah. Hannah was concerned I might have too many slides. With the amount of cross-fertilisation between what Bav and Michael have been talking about, I'm afraid we're in trouble here. If I could just take about an hour, I will try and be brief. So architects, we want to talk about responses that relate to the physical environment, okay? But today I'm going to try not to focus so much on buildings, but the process by which they come to be and how we pull in lots of different people. In two examples from councils that I think are doing exemplary work in this field. So one in Redbridge, Seven Kings, Redbridge Hub, and one in Thurrock. If we do pull people into the process well enough, that in itself starts to break down barriers. And I can only suggest that in the time we've got, but I can see it in action. And I do want to quote one of Michael's excellent dictums: building trust, sharing power, right? So those are, I hope I'm going to show you things in action. Next slide. Okay, so the first one is co-design process for a community hub in Seven Kings in Redbridge, East London. In this hub, there's library, workspace, cafe, children's services, and a GP practice. I've chosen not to talk about barriers, but about how we're bringing these things together. Barriers may come up more in the discussion, and then there certainly are some to be overcome. The second one is an earlier stage strategic planning about how well-being, social care, estate decisions can contribute to bringing people into the process and also making a town centre more healthy and more of a well-being place. Next, please. Straight into Redbridge. Okay, so Seven Kings is number 5 on this little diagram. I hope you can roughly see that. So Redbridge is consolidating lots of services into the kind of hubs we've already been talking about, and I've already mentioned what kind of services will be coming in there. Redbridge Living is the council's development subsidiary. They're doing this, and they set up a process with Mutual Gain, ourselves, and the Saltitian Foundation to get a representative cross-section of residents who live in the ward that will be shared by this hub. Next, please. So the hub is part of the left-hand blue blob there, which is a 236 home Redbridge Living, so council development effectively of flats and family homes. Seven Kings got a new Crossrail station. That's the catalyst for all of this stuff. It has had almost no new development since before the Second World War. But now Crossrail corridor will bring in people from the catchment area, and the idea is to intensify this town centre and position the hub. Next slide, please. Right at the head of this building, facing the new station. So that's just to locate where you are. And the hub functions that we already briefly mentioned will build networks and footfall. And they're going to have an interesting effect on a high street that I haven't been back to since COVID. Okay, so I don't know how it's been shaping up. It was restaurants, fast food, convenience stores, lots of things related to cars. A surprising number of shops selling car accessories, like alloy wheels and stuff. And I'm hopeful this development will help revitalise it by bringing complementary services to stuff that's there and promoting new things. So next slide, please. The vision that I can report came from this workshop process, which I'll talk a bit more about in a second, was that council staff would not be, as in the left-hand option here, all on the top floor shut away from the public, but that they would be distributed throughout the building. This is already, I know anybody in this room will understand, a really significant decision to be taken. Next, please. See, Hannah, I'm going quickly. We're getting through the slides. Okay, we did 5 workshops. I'm just going to touch on the 4th workshop, which focused on the health spaces. The health spaces here in brown, so on the top floor, the GP practice. Second influential decision by local residents was they were asked whether, we worked through whether the GP healthcare provision should take up the whole top floor, and they thought it was important that it should be mixed with other things, particularly library and education services, which are on the left-hand side here. And so that led to it being 1 GP practice rather than 2, 1 GP practice with space for expansion. And there's a whole discussion about the relationship between the partners in this process. So the CCG, Clinical Commissioning Group, North East London Foundation Trust, Redbridge Living, Collateral Head, healthcare specialist architects, ourselves, and the other participants in the process. We can come back to a discussion if useful. Next slide, please. So this is just the intro slide, one of the intro slides from the 4th workshop. I put it up because it lets you see what the Redbridge Living aspiration for these spaces is. These are their words, not ours. So it needs to enable the delivery of health services and, critically, collaboration between different health stakeholders. And in their view, that's everybody. Okay, so that's everybody who lives in the area, because they all have an involvement in the well-being of the place. And we had a fantastic diversity of people. We had some very vocal young people in a couple of the little breakout groups that I facilitated. We had some older people who were incredibly tech savvy, and some other older people who we sent somebody off to deliver a laptop through to. It really was, I think, a pretty good representation of the community. And also people started to bring their neighbours into later sessions. It was all digitally done. People would say, oh, is it all right? I brought my neighbour from upstairs in. I brought my aunt in because she knows about this stuff. The council reckons, I don't know how this has been calculated, they reached 7,000 or 8,000 people throughout the consultation process. So that's 7 workshops overall, other things. So the last thing on this one, accommodate GP and community health sessions, and those won't all be in the GP practice. There are activity rooms, various other spaces, workspaces, and then reception and waiting areas. Next slide, please. So this is really important. It's what's your experience of accessing health? I won't spend time on this. This is just took a lot of development. This is an interactive whiteboard that we used in breakout sessions where people could place icons and size them depending on their importance. And we get a discussion going, we'd record it in this way, take a snapshot on notes, and then move the discussion on. So we were trying to access different ways that people think about the experience of space. And you can see the stopwatch, for instance. How long do you think you'd be spending here? What's important? Comfort. There's a sofa. Next, please. Keeping the pace up. Right, the last one on this absolute taster of this co-design process. This is the alternative way of provoking discussion. We gave people, different options. Interestingly, very often these breakout groups where we worked through these options, which were 6 to 10 people, didn't choose one. They chose, I want to get to my point as quickly and direct as possible, but I also want to know what's going on in other parts of the community hub. So that we took into the discussion and influenced design in the final report. Only a flavour of that. Next slide, please. Moving east along the Thames to Thurrock. South Ockenden is a 1960s new town village, on the borderline of that sort of size thing. It's planned to get up to 10,000 new homes in the surrounding area. So there's going to be a huge amount of development here. It's very well connected to London on the C2C line. And the revitalised centre will have a job to do to provide identity, as well as services, and as well as facilitating networks to bring all the new residents into a meaningful place community. Now, Thurrock is incredibly innovative in terms of its approach to housing, health and care, community-based development, devolving support services right down to the neighbourhood, people living there, empowering local people, and they have a commitment to this and a unified model of developing housing, health, and social care. They work really closely together the whole time. So this is a really quick example of how this leads to strategy for a potential town centre. Next one, please. Next slide, please. So on the left, the centre of the town, middle of that big photo, you see Derwent Parade in the middle. Is a rather imposing early 1960s shopping parade. It's not really connected to anything around it, but there are lots of little council services and ad hoc sites around it. And the idea is that over a period of time, these could be brought into that red line site to the south, which is currently a health centre and a huge amount of tarmac, parking, whatever, which in itself could become more prominent and could pull people into a range of activities. There's a nursery next door, so it could be a multi-generational site, also with older people's care facilities and housing on it. But with community centre coming in there and a GP practice, which is there, locating into the new building. Next, please. And this allows different sites around the town centre to be released. Now, the Derwent Parade produces this huge vista which ends in a single-storey Royal Mail sorting office and connects to nothing else. So the ultimate goal for the architects is to say, actually, this could all be made much better connected together. We could bring greenery and green landscaping into the town centre and make this new hub quite prominent on the southeast corner there of the main road through the town, and start to make sense of it as a place. These strategic diagrams we've been working on prior to going out to consultation. The whole project has been paused, but they're supposed to be, they will be, the first starting point as a provocation to local people to get involved in the engagement. They are not a solution. However, next slide, please. We have been developing ideas for the health hub, and these diagrams, which I won't have time to go through in detail, show connections to different functions, existing functions, the nursery and things around, which will bring people into the site and integrate well-being initiatives with everyday life. And the next slide, penultimate slide. Ultimate slide. Okay, very good, Hannah. You'll be very pleased. So this is what started to take place. As you can see, to take shape at an early stage, a local asset, which we expect to be significantly shaped by the input of local people, which both has a community-facing side, which will start to build this hub, and a number of, missing a slide actually. That's why I'm never mind. A number of happily designed, so in terms of happy, well-being, energy, sustainable, accessible and inviting to the local community spaces, which are to do with older people's care and support, and also multi-generational activities bringing people together. Good. How am I doing on time?
You're about there. That was pretty well spot on.
You were right to take that slide out.
I'm sorry about that. I don't know.
So it's probably me.
Okay. Thank you, Patrick, so much. That was brilliant to get a kind of flavour for those areas, and I think to hear that kind of some of those tactical decisions about location and space and, you know, the impact that has on place. So thank you very much indeed. Right, finally to Serena Horgan and Nicola Wheeler at Catalyst Housing. They've been working on the redevelopment of the Havelock estate in Southall. And Catalyst have been able to work really successfully with health colleagues, with local community and with charities as well, to address some quite big health challenges in this part of Ealing. So they're going to talk to us a bit more about their reflections on this project. Over to Serena and Nicola.
Great, thanks, Hannah. And it's great to see actually an emerging theme across a number of the panelists here. So can we just move on to the next slide, please? Thank you. So just Nicola and I will share this morning a regeneration scheme that we've worked on together for a number of years. And Nicola very much from the community investment point of view and the engagement strategy that she's led and developed, and I very much from a delivery aspect. So next slide, please. So Havelock's located in the London Borough of Ealing, which is in Southall, built around the 60s, 70s, and we were selected in partnership to work with Ealing to regenerate this estate. So the estate was very inward looking, very difficult to navigate, with homes suffering from defects very common of that period. There was really high levels of ASB and low levels of resident satisfaction, but very, very strong sense of community at Havelock and a real sense that people wanted to create a great place to live. So next slide, please. So if I fast forward a few years of our lives, and we have delivered the first phase down at Havelock, which looks great. It's nearly 300 homes, a mix of tenures, and we've reintroduced that traditional street scene. But most importantly, we've delivered the green space that runs from the north to the south of the estate. So a real quick win within the first phase of a long regeneration project. We've created a great play area here to the north, and there's a number of doorstop play areas throughout. There is a real strong sense of community ownership of this space, and it's really well used. And I think this is really a great result from an ongoing engagement and resident consultation, and then being able to make the choices for this space and to be able to use this. Next slide, please. So Havelock benefits from a great location. So to the south, we have the Grand Union Canal, where the original estate really did turn its back. And we've now opened this up to be a much more user-friendly place and a place where people actually want to go. So a place where people want to walk and meet. And Nicola will talk you through a little bit more about that in her slides. The blue line you see to the east here of the estate it was a privately owned dock that we at Catalyst purchased. We now manage and have a number of residential moorings on there that we also look after. We created a bridge over the dock to open up a walkway from Havelock to south or east, so to create a healthy network from one area that was quite turned its back on each other, I think is fair to say. Next slide, please. So we plan to deliver this project over 4 phases with Ealing, and I really believe that the success of the first phase down at Havelock has been a result of that ongoing community development and engagement. We're currently reviewing the future phases, but I think it's really important that we haven't stopped our continuous projects and our ongoing engagement, and we're delivering a number of projects on site at the moment while the project is paused. That I'll hand you over to Nicola now that will talk you through.
Thanks very much, Serena. Just onto the next slide, please. So through the regeneration so far, we've resourced a dedicated community investment worker at Havelock, and they've been responsible for really identifying what the local priorities are through community engagement and that relationship building that's so important, as we've already established. And working with the local community, we identified very early on, of course, that health inequality was stark. Things like high levels of physical inactivity, cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes and childhood obesity are very prevalent in this community, and that the kind of poor quality of the environmental spaces, of the green spaces, was really impacting on people's ability and their willingness to make use of those green spaces locally. So as Serena's shown, the Havelock estate sits along the Grand Union Canal, but this, along with the southern parts of the estate, which are scheduled to be in the final phases of the regeneration, had become a real focus for things like drug and alcohol abuse, drug dealing, rough sleeping, and fly tipping. And although these were in the final phases of the regeneration, I think it's fair to say that we weren't prepared to just sit back and wait for those phases to come forward. We really wanted to look at how we could support the local community to make a difference there as soon as possible. Next slide, please. We were able to achieve some very practical quick wins at Havelock early on by just taking forward some early intervention projects. We did lots of things like pop-up engagement events in the open spaces locally and had neighbourhood action days with litter picking. And this was really just about establishing a visible presence and talking to people about what was important to them and how they might like to get involved in projects moving forward. And the very first one of these was the Bixley Triangle project. There's a little colourful wall that you can see just in the middle of the slide there. It was an overgrown patch of land right next to the canal, thoroughly inaccessible, littered with needles and soiled clothes. And we managed to purchase the land as part of the regeneration and work with the local policing team and environmental groups to clear it, level it, get it reseeded, and work with the Children's Centre to have this sort of roving art installation project, which is what you can see there with the wonderful. And the space now boasts flowering fruit trees and native hedge and lots of spring flowering bulbs, and the nursery children visit it regularly and they host their annual summer picnic there at the end of term. And this early project then led to us working with the Canal and Rivers Trust to secure £10,000 of funding from Tesco's through the Bags for Help scheme. So it was a small pot of money, but the idea was that it would enable us to carry out further improvements along this 1 kilometre stretch of the canal towpath that bordered Havelock. And again, we worked with the local schools and community groups, as well as like the London Probation Service and our own teams of CSR volunteers from Catalyst to regularly bring teams of people down and do litter picks and vegetation clearance along the towpath. By this point, next slide, please. Thank you, Tara. Thank you. And by this point, we'd sort of built up a really strong network of local partnerships and had good relationships with the local community. We'd found those community pillars, the people who care really passionately about where they live and they want to get involved and make a difference. And we supported some of them to establish a group called the Good Neighbours. And I think it was because we had this established presence and these good local connections that we were invited by the council to be part of a social prescribing pilot back in 2018. And later we managed to secure 60,000 from the GLA's Active Londoners Fund to scale the approach that we were developing there. And this was, of course, prior to NHS England confirming investment in social prescribing through primary care networks. So we were very much involved in the early stages in shaping what the approach could look like in Southall. And that approach was very much one that was a hyper-local approach, recognising that people rarely travel far to participate in physical activity and that it needed to be things that's happening on their doorstep, and aimed on really building on what was already happening. So identifying quite often the community voluntary sector providers that were delivering great projects and services, but also struggling to sustain their activities just through lack of awareness about what they were doing and low take up. I think we can go to the next slide. So we worked really closely with the local GP surgery, which was the Waterside Medical Centre, to help make those opportunities to get active very, very visible. You often find that you could walk into your own GP surgery and you wouldn't know if you were in a GP reception in Edgbaston in Birmingham or if you were in Southall in Ealing. The information is very generic about smoking cessation, or speak to your GP if. And we found that, you know, the GPs there, the receptionists, knew nothing about what was happening right outside the surgery. So for example, we were able to, can we just go back to the previous slide there? Is that where the, yeah. So we were able to, through this mapping exercise that we did with local people, identify that there was a canoe club that would rock up every Tuesday to deliver open paddling sessions for adults and children. The community centre next door ran a women's exercise class for just £1. So we worked with the patient participation group at the GP surgery and our Good Neighbours group to map and evaluate the accessibility of those local facilities, much in the same way as sort of Patrick's example there, like really thinking about how people use those spaces. And in terms of sort of what the outcomes of our social prescribing work look like, the next slide is again, thank you, Tara. Prior to the pandemic, we'd managed to engage with 30 local residents and support them to be able to access those activities. We very much took a kind of what matters to me approach and had very meaningful conversations with individuals in the community. And our community link worker, which was funded through the Active Londoners funding, was able to identify what might motivate people and what the barriers might be that were preventing them from participating. So often she would attend sessions with people who really lacked the confidence, and also delivered training to some of those community providers so that they were geared up to receive referrals from people who might be experiencing long-term health conditions or perhaps who had never exercised before in their lives. With the Active Londoners funding, we managed to get some signage working with Canal and Rivers Trust, some really lovely welcome signs on the canal towpath and some way markers for a Havelock Healthy Walk that ran that 1 kilometre stretch, and issued people with pedometers and things so that even if they were anxious about participating in classes, people could exercise in their own time and at their own pace. And during the pandemic, we provided telephone-based support to 230 people on the Havelock estate to help them to get physically fit and stay mentally well during the pandemic. This included weekly phone calls to some people and the distribution of wellbeing packs, including things like yoga mats, colouring exercise books and skipping ropes that were distributed throughout the project. So those are just sort of some of the examples of the things that we've been working on. I think from our point of view, you know, there have been challenges along the way, as there always are. Initially, it was very much about how to get GPs on board. This was prior to social prescribing really taking off. But we found that kind of making things really easy, like mapping all of that information and getting it installed, these active living maps installed in the GP receptions was a kind of quick win for us in building those relationships with GPs. The challenges are quite different now. So we find that you know, there are social prescribers based within each of the primary care networks. That's usually one social prescriber to 6 to 8 GPs covering between 30 and 50,000 patients. So they're increasingly overstretched. And they're also only really able to reach those people who are regularly accessing GP services already. And again, only then if the GP is minded to make that referral to the social prescriber. So we see that there's a really important role for organisations like housing associations that are invested in communities in having a community-based offer. Our community link workers spent 18 months building those relationships with social prescribers in Southall and Ealing more widely. She now attends their monthly meetings and helps us to really make that case for a broader approach. We think that we can really be part of the solution. So We manage 5,000 homes across Ealing. And if somebody presents at a GP surgery and they happen to be a Catalyst resident, perhaps they're suffering from heart problems because they're stressed as a result of losing their job, we can help them with things like money and benefits advice, employment support. Beyond that, we've got access to things like fuel top-up vouchers for people on prepayment meters. We have an individual grants programme where we recently purchased a bike and a lock for an elderly gentleman on Havelock who didn't feel safe using public transport. So just really practical ways that we can help to support people to have a better experience of where they live and to have a healthy lifestyle. So I just wanted to finish up by saying, I think, housing associations do so much more than just building homes. At Catalyst, we're really committed to creating those homes and communities people love. And we see ourselves as really well placed through the relationships that we have with local partners, through the knowledge that we have of those local communities, to really sort of bring people together and to be kind of the catalyst, if you like, for some of those conversations that can make the change happen. Although our externally funded social prescribing project has come to an end and the regeneration at the moment is being reviewed, those relationships that we've established really haven't. And we'll continue to work on the ground with our colleagues, our partners and our customers and communities to make sure that as far as possible, they get the best possible social prescribing offer and ultimately improved health outcomes as well. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Nicola and Serena. It's really nice to get kind of a good idea of the neighbourhood and to kind of see how that joined up approach really demonstrates, I think, how we can all sort of use health as an impetus for really great projects in our in the neighbourhoods we're working in. Right, thank you all for your presentations. I think you've really helped to demonstrate how current a lot of this stuff is, and just great to hear the different perspectives from different sectors and looking at design specifics, looking at the kind of policy specifics and the community aspect of it. And as has been mentioned, I think there is some key themes being drawn out by all of you. I'm going to start just looking at the poll results. Possibly unsurprisingly, the majority of people are saying stretch budgets and resources is the kind of the biggest barrier that's on their minds. Briefly, I'm going to go to the panel for just a short reflection from each of you on this before we get to some questions from the audience. Michael, I know that you in your report have some kind of actions for change. Is there anything in there that you think can help, obviously stretch budgets and resources is nothing new, but is there anything in there that can kind of help our network, maybe with a creative response to this?
I suppose just a couple of quick things. One, that idea of the broadened case for health, and Nicola's been talking about link workers in housing associations. So bringing in those different players helps spread the spending to where people have the money to act. And the other thing, I suppose, is my point earlier about equity through design. So an awful lot of services are underused because they aren't designed with the right people, and that getting that design piece right at the start, understand that requires some investment, it pays out dividends over a long time.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. Patrick, what do you think is the role for designers and architects within the context of stretched budgets and resources? You're on mute, Patrick.
Of course I am, it's traditional. Where we've been able to get involved in that conversation is with clients like the ones I've been talking about, who already have an approach which is about maximising existing strengths and communities and trying to build on those rather than looking for need and throwing money at it. To caricature, it would be great to have more. It would be great to have more resource, of course, but we've been talking about social prescribing, which is good. This attitude of inviting people into the right place where they can meet other people who have similar interests and start interacting and finding solutions that they're leading to their issues that they've got. And there's an analogy in Froome, in health-based general practice, which I'm sure some of the audience are aware of. Our role is to help shape these places that bring people into them, essentially, and the spaces between the buildings. Really interested to hear about. People don't travel to exercise, we know it, but we need to keep reinforcing it. There are places in London and elsewhere, particularly, that just don't have local green space in any scale. Okay, but new developments can take care of that. I could go on, but I won't. That's the snapshot message.
Okay, yeah, so we put our faith in new development. Bav, what?
No, we need to change that so that we can refurbish housing. Don't get me started.
Bav, what do you think is the role for the private sector in kind of responding to the challenge of stretched budgets and resources?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, that's where us as consultants, we come in to help relieve that pressure and hopefully to provide some expertise. But I think kind of drawing back on what I was saying in my presentation, that mapping of skills and knowledge is really important. We know from our NHS client perspective that, you know, resources are stretched, estates teams are stretched, but I think that bringing together of minds is not a, you know, it sounds like such a simple thing to do, but you know, mapping expertise and again that access to funding point to hopefully ease the financial pressure, and understanding what's available is another route to easing that financial burden. I do think, and it's something I didn't mention in my presentation, but I think that drive is always financial best value, and the idea of social best value is often lost. And you know, whilst the kind of Green Book central government appraisal to assessing schemes and whether public sector schemes and whether they go forward, it's been reviewed recently, and there's supposed to be more of an emphasis on achieving social best value. The precursor and determinant is often the financial case, and that's often where a lot of opportunities fall down, because that financial value comes later down the line, and it's about that upfront social value determinant that needs to be taken into consideration a bit more. So yeah, I fully appreciate that that's why and what are the reasons behind that coming at the top of the poll, but hopefully coming together of minds and kind of accessing the opportunities available should help ease that in some way.
Yeah, that's great. And Bav, actually that responds a little bit to a question that we've had from Susan in the Q&A, which we'll come back to. But yeah, I think that the point about sort of building on what's already there is a really good one. Serena, I'm going to come to you. I think you kind of already drawn a bit on the role of housing associations, because you've sort of demonstrated how you can kind of bring together different agencies and look at funding in new ways. And actually, in a moment, I'm going to ask Diana Fitzwilliam from the Canal and River Trust to reflect on their involvement in the project, because I know she's in the audience. But yeah, have you got anything else to add on sort of the role of organisations like Catalyst within this?
Yeah, so I think from our perspective, it's really important to map what is already available, which I think I've just already said, and that was an exercise we did at Havelock, and it was really important to see actually there is a community facility 2 minutes down the road, but how do we help our customers use that facility? So bringing together not just, you know, the local authority, but other housing associations, and how an asset can be a shared asset to have a much greater benefit to the wider community, I think that's one that's really important for me. So we just don't create something new within this silo of a large regeneration scheme, but we actually utilise what is available within that surrounding area. So it has that stronger ripple effect, I feel, from the regen. You're not concentrated within your red line, but you're also having an impact beyond that.
Yeah,
that's just my point. I don't know, Nicola may correct me on that one.
No, I absolutely agree. I think we have to always start with what's already there. I think the only thing I would add is that, I mean, I absolutely agree, kind of funding is one of the biggest barriers, but I'm always astonished at how much you can achieve with very little, just by sort of identifying organisations that have got similar objectives and kind of bright sparks within them that share your vision and values, and actually you can get a lot done just by working together in that way. And you know, sometimes it's those things that really matter to people on the ground. So
absolutely, and you've teed me up really nicely, Nicola, to introduce Diana. Diana, if you're there, I think we're just adding you so that you can speak now. It would be really great to just hear, because I understand that, you know, the Canal and River Trust, like Nicola said, has a sort of shared ambition around wellbeing. So if you could just give us a brief reflection on your involvement in the Havelock project. Are you there? There we go.
Here.
Hi, Diana.
Hello, I'm just sorting my video out. Hello.
Brilliant. Go ahead.
Hello. Yeah, it was really interesting to hear what everyone was saying. I work for Canal and River Trust, and we are the Wellbeing and Waterways charity, for those of you who don't know about us. And we manage Grand Union Canal, which Nicola was talking about, as well as canals and rivers that go through 15 London authorities. Yeah, we have really found it useful working with Catalyst, because it's opened a lot of partnerships up for us as well. Because I think, as Nicola said, or perhaps Serena said, the original estate had its back to the canal, and obviously the canal is a very good resource for health and well-being for activities on the water and off the water, things like walking. It supports people's mental health just being by the water. And I think some of the opportunities it opened up for us was really through the Havelock Steering Group, which was a partnership group with things like the local schools, the local children's centre, and also local community pillars, the Good Neighbours project, as well as the Canoe Club. So we have been able to work really closely, and we're also looking at joint funding opportunities for things like widening the towpath. We also have lots of volunteering opportunities that Catalyst residents get referred into, and we were part of the Healthy Walk social prescribing project, and we're now working very closely with Catalyst Community Link Worker to refer residents into our activities, again, on the water and off the water. So from our point of view, it's been a really positive experience, and I think we all get to have our say about what will and won't work, and that gets taken on board. So yeah, from our point of view, it's giving us an access, especially to people who are a very long way away from perhaps on and off water activities. So working in partnership has really brought us a lot of benefits.
That's brilliant. Thanks, Diana. Really good to have your perspective and also the beautiful view of the canal behind you.
I'd like to say I'm there, but obviously I'm at home.
I'm now going to come to a few audience questions. If anyone would like to come on camera, then yeah, just raise your hand. But I'll go to one from Stephen Boxall first that came through the Q&A, which is in response to the stuff in Ashford. So, Bav, you may be best placed. He was just saying that a lot of the NHS had done a lot of work on how to plan and make places to ensure that people are healthy, and they produced a document to help with the planning process. And I think, you know, he's sort of questioning whether things like that have been forgotten. I'm sure that this has happened in other places as well. Do you feel, Bav, that there is a sense that work is we're not making the most of existing work that's already been done?
Yeah, I think COVID potentially put a halt to some kind of good practices that were in the pipeline. But I think Stephen's example was, I think he mentioned that he'd left in 2010, and the examples I went through with the One Use scheme that's been rolled out across the county has come on board since then. So I would hope, I don't know too much about the detail of the scheme, but I would hope that that had led, you know, the work that he saw in the early kind of 2000s had led to what we see today across Kent in the One Use shops that are across the county, that's delivering on that, you know, kind of healthy lifestyle kind of advice and drop-in sessions to help people make the right decisions for themselves. So hopefully that work has been continued. But I fear that some good work may have been kind of pushed off course over the past year, but hopefully that can be picked up and kind of reignited.
Yeah, and I think as well, you know, it's clear from the commitment on the panel, people want to go into the work that has been done, and I guess it's on all of us, isn't it, to do that. Thanks, Bav. We've got a question from Peter, who I think is happy to come on camera. So Peter, if you are there, hopefully we are adding you now. Are you with us? Looks like it's just loading now.
Oh, great.
Thanks, Peter.
Okay, thanks. Hello. Yeah, Peter Jones. I'm based in the Centre for Transport Studies at UCL, and I wanted to ask a sort of transport-related question. I mean, it seems to me in a broad sense, there are two aspects the health sector has an interest in. One is obviously in active travel as part of active lifestyle, so people get physically fit and mentally healthy by just travelling around on foot and by cycling. And the other thing is, in last December, the NHS produced their net zero carbon plan, taking responsibility for the carbon generated by the travel activities associated with the NHS, which I think is 14% of all carbon. So I'm wondering, given that, and maybe asking Bab, for example, that when the health service is looking at new sites, are they actively now making sure that they're accessible on foot and by cycle, and that most people can get there by public transport? So they are actually promoting active travel and carbon reduction at the same time.
Great question. We'll go to Bav and Patrick as well afterwards if you've got a reflection. Thanks. Go ahead, Bav.
Yeah, absolutely. I know from a couple of hospital sites in particular we're working on at the moment that in recent years there's been a real encouragement for patients to use the space, especially when they're kind of in nice greenfield locations, or because of the scale there's good quality open space. And I know one client, North East London NHS Foundation Trust, who operate Goodmace Hospital in Redbridge. They a few years ago introduced kind of a loop walk and a signposted loop walk, which were kind of a short walk or a longer walk to encourage patients as part of their recuperation to kind of, you know, make use of the space and walk around and give them ideas of calories that they've burned and things like that. And small things like that make a real difference to encourage people. And we do see that more and more on the larger sites. It's easier, kind of larger schemes as opposed to a health centre where the kind of activities that kind of Nicola was talking about in terms of bringing the community and opportunities into that GP space, so that it's a real local GP as opposed to kind of a blanket GP service, is also important on a smaller scale. And on the net zero carbon, yeah, we're advising a number of trusts on delivering Boris's 40 new hospitals over the next kind of 15 years. And one of the budgetary pressures, and rightly so, is the need to deliver electric hospitals. And so on the net zero carbon point, that really is top of the agenda in terms of IT and bringing modern facilities to the local community, and trying to mitigate the impact of, as you say, you know, the NHS and the impact it has on carbon emissions. That really is top of the agenda, and we see that through the work that we're doing on the new hospitals. So yeah, I definitely think that's important. And on the transport point, it's sometimes difficult with sites. So a number of the ones that we're working on, those same hospital sites, are often on greenfield locations, or they might be reconfiguring existing sites. But there are sustainable transport corridors which link to the local authority, local plans, and that's to encourage people to be visiting healthcare facilities in as many means as possible. But it's often difficult, as I say, with the larger sites because of where they're usually located to encourage that. But from what I've seen, they are doing what they can.
Great, thanks, Bav. And Patrick, is there anything from perhaps the Redbridge sites that are incorporating active travel, or any other schemes you're working?
Yes, I mean, there's a huge amount in all the schemes we work on. The 2 points come together quite neatly. I mean, there is a lot of talk, and I think rightly, about a modal shift in how people get around town, cities, settlements, illustrated by how behaviour during COVID. But to Steve Boxall's earlier point, we're not yet, I think, joining this up as best practice across the country. And I have a particular hobby horse about the disappearance of the concept of lifetime neighbourhoods that we had a few years ago. In whose domain, I mean, it's evidently possibly a council, but it needs to link developments, is making the environment around buildings accessible to everybody, navigable for everybody with different needs, and inviting people out into places where they interact, get exercise, get healthier, and are happier on all the indicators. So at the moment, that's falling between stools, because big developments are developer-led, you know, or a big regeneration. You're reaching out, that's brilliant, beyond your boundaries, but that's because that's part of your purpose and you're good at it. Not every developer has that interest, okay? And we don't really have the mechanism for all the theory about SIL, Section 106 and so forth, to integrate all those things into the initiatives we've been talking about today, which are really valuable, potentially. You know, I mean, Future of London is a shining beacon of sharing good practice, but it's London, and it's, you know, a wide audience, but it's not enough people. So this debate does need to get public and get political, I think. You know, there needs to be a reclaiming of public space for these purposes, and that is to do with well-being, movement, exercise and happiness.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think, again, it's sort of a call to action for all of us, isn't it, to kind of shout louder about some of these things. Right, and we've got one more question, time for one more question. I'm going to go to Michael and Serena for some quick reflections, and then I'll sum up. So we had a question from Tom Selby at London Borough of Croydon, who's basically talking about the role that local authorities can play as a kind of key facilitator between sectors to get some of this stuff moving. And he was just really asking what you feel is the potential for social prescribing. So Michael and Serena, if you've got any quick reflections to add on that, that'd be great.
I'm sure I can start. Social prescribing is, like, it's great conceptually, and it's one of those things that is a broad enough concept that it takes in so many tons of different definitions as to what it means. I think at the moment, particularly local authorities have a role to play. The funding for social prescribing goes to link workers, but the model, of course, refers out and is used. The cost is borne by other services. So there's a role to play to tracking who's using those services, what sort of impact they are having, and supporting those, whether it's the third sector, whether it's social enterprises, to be available to everybody.
Great, thank you. And Serena, I know, any reflections on your work and how it could be scaled up, or the impact it could have in other neighbourhoods?
Yeah, I do. I think it would be great if it could be. The work Nicola and her team have championed at Havelock has been amazing. I think the local authority, obviously, the resource issue and that result to the poll comes back into that, Hannah, doesn't it? And it's how we as housing associations can assist the local authority in widening out their projects. So I think it's very much about the collaboration, working, moving forward together. So not working in the silo approach. So I think that's one that we could possibly, I know Nicola and her team are looking at moving forward.
Yeah, definitely, absolutely. And actually, while I've got you, Serena, a quick follow-up from Chloe Oates, who's from Mount Anvil, who was just asking, I think she wants to congratulate you on your fantastic approach and just all the kind of work, you know, it obviously takes time, this stuff, and effort, the community engagement. But how are you recording the improvements that you're making? What's the sort of systems for monitoring the progress there?
So we've done some quite grassroots initials case studies at Havelock, and we're monitoring the progress of those throughout the regeneration, but we're also looking at the employment impact. So we've done a number of work streams at Havelock. I mean, I should say we won this in 2012, so I've been on the project for some time now. So there is a number of areas that we are tracking and monitoring at Havelock as the project moves forward. It's probably too much detail for today, but happy to have another conversation another time, Chloe.
Great. And when we do the write-up for the event, we'll share some links so that people can go away and hear more. But yeah, thank you. Such a broad project, so I'm sure there are a million things. Well, we're going to have to draw things to a close now. So I just really want to thank the panel, and I'm sure the audience like to join me in thanking them for their time and the presentations. It's been a brilliant discussion. Clear that there are some, you know, there are ways of overcoming these challenges. We just need to collaborate and be kind of creative and committed. I'm thinking that building trust, sharing power may be the catchphrase now that we all need to use, and that's, you know, definitely a really strong theme coming out around sort of putting communities first. As ever, you know, it's nothing new, but I think it's about reappraising how we do that at the moment. So I would just like to thank our sponsors again, Montagu Evans, Mount Anvil and Pollard Thomas Edwards Architects. Please keep an eye on our website and mailing list for any other events in the series. And we are really hoping to announce quite soon a virtual international field trip, so keep your eyes peeled, should be really exciting. And we're hoping to have an in-person event in autumn, which will be lovely to see some people face to face. And we think we're going to focus there on the sort of language and terminology issues. So thanks once again for our panel and to our audience. Also want to say thank you to the Future of London team helping things run smoothly behind the scenes, Nicola, Tara and Tara, thank you. And just a quick plug finally on a different topic. Through our other programme, Building Recovery, we are holding a network survey at the moment, which has launched until mid-June. The aim of this survey is to really try and gather some really good data on what the sector feels are the challenges and the ambitions around building fairer cities. We'd really appreciate as many people as possible just taking 10 minutes out of their day to complete this so that we get some really good data. There's a prize draw for everybody who completes it with some very sort of urban themed prizes. So have a look at the link in the chat, and yeah, we'd really value your input. Finally, you'll be sent a very short survey about this event, and we really appreciate any feedback so that we can improve for the future. So that is it from us today. Thank you ever so much for everyone joining in the discussion and for your time. And yeah, we hope to see you at another event soon. Thank you.